Okay. Jesus hangs the King of Jerusalem. This is going to be my introduction to the Jesus Tales series, where we look at the Jesuses of the Old Testament that the Jesuses of the New Testament were based on. So this is a literary approach. You can kind of forget history, forget theology. If you come into this with a predetermined history or a predetermined theology, you're going to miss how easy it is to see these ancient Jesuses that did the same thing as the New Testament Jesuses did. So just read the stories, true or not, as they are presented. I'm not invoking a long history of editing, but that is the norm for all ancient literature. I will say some things here are true according to the literature's point of view, just as we might have scientific or historical reservations about Harry Potter flying on a broom. I would still write that he flew on a broom if I was analyzing that storyline. So relax and enjoy the literature. Okay, here we have in the book of Jesus, which we know as Joshua, chapter 10, verse 22, then Jesus said, open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave. They did so and brought the 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they brought the kings out to Jesus, Jesus summoned all the Israelites and said to the chiefs of the warriors who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. When they came near and put their feet on their necks, and Jesus said to them, do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus Jehovah will do. Jesus struck them down to death, and he hung them on 5 trees. They hung on the trees until evening. At sunset, Jesus commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves. They set large stones against the mouth of the cave that remain there to this very day. So this is from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. The brackets here, I've replaced the word Joshua with the word Jesus, and we'll explain that in a minute. And I've replaced the term the Lord with Jehovah. And sometimes you'll see going to use Jehovah, and we'll explain why soon enough. So, as far as New Testament books, we're going to start with Mark, because Mark is considered by the large majority of biblical scholars to be the first gospel written. He's anonymous, but for simplicity's sake, we will call him Mark. He is not the earliest Testament writer. Honor goes to Paul in his letters to the early assemblies of God throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. However, it is not clear that Paul is writing about a Jesus of Nazareth. We will say Christ for today. I hope to lay out evidence that Jesus of Nazareth is Mark's Septuagint Jesuses. The Septuagint is the Greek Old Testament, and it has some of the same things Jesus does. Matthew and Luke usually recognize Mark's sources and expand on his ideas using other aspects of Mark's sources. Mark's Gospel of Jesus is in some ways simply the latest edition of the book of Jesus, updated for a new age. All right, so I got a little chart here. We're going to compare the book of Jesus that I read just a minute ago with some sections from Mark's Gospel of Jesus that we're about to read. So Jesus Nun kills the king, and we compare that with Jesus of Nazareth dies as the king. The king's body is hung on a tree, or the king is put on a cross to die. The body is taken down in the evening. Same thing. The body is taken down in the evening. Body is put in a cave. Basically the same thing. Body put in a rock-hewn tomb. Large rocks are rolled in front of the cave. A large stone rolled in front of the cave. That's the same. And here it's the opposite. The body remains to this day, and the body has gone. So we're going to flesh these out. Mark's use of the King of Jerusalem. Mark 15:16. When the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him, and they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. So we see the concept of the king of the Jews or the Judeans there. King of the Jews. In this case, it would make sense to use the word Judeans here as an ethnographic term, meaning the people of the culture or region of Judea. Either way, Jews or Judeans, King of the Jews means King of Jerusalem, which is the capital of Judea. Technically, Adonizedek in the story of Jesus Nun was a king of Canaanites. Still, he was the king of Jerusalem before it became the capital of Israel or Judea. Both times in both stories, a man is killed as king of Jerusalem. So that's a similarity there. Mark's use of hanging on a tree. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." So the book of Jesus has him putting the King of Jerusalem on a tree and hanging him. And Mark has crucifixion on a cross. And my claim is that these are very similar. And I'm going to back that up here. Mark 15:32, "Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now so that we may see and believe." So this is more about the King of the Jews, the King of Israel, and that's related to the idea of the King of Jerusalem. So as far as being hung on a tree or a cross, none other than Paul and the author of Acts see things the same way that I am presenting it. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's a tree or a cross, since two New Testament authors clearly declare Christ died on a tree. Some later Gospels even have Christ also dying on a tree. So these are not Gospels. This is Galatians and Acts. Of course, some people believe Acts is written by the author of the Gospel of Luke. So that may be a gospel author writing Acts. But here, Paul in Galatians 3:13, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree.'" There, he could be equivocating there, right? He's calling across a tree. But these are a little more clear. Acts 5:30, we have Peter speaking. "The God of our ancestors raised up Jesus, whom you had killed by hanging him on a tree." And in Acts 10:39, again, Peter speaking, "We are witnesses to all that he did, both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree." And in Acts 13:29, this is supposedly Paul speaking, "When they had carried out everything that was written about him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb." So all three of those in Acts, for two of Peter speaking and one of Paul speaking, says they take him down from a tree. And in 1 Peter 2:24, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we may cease from sinning and live for righteousness. By his wounds you were healed." And that's the NET version. The NRSV has cross instead of tree. And where it has cross in the NRSV, it has a little asterisk, and you look down, and lo and behold, it says "or tree." So it appears that the early editions of 1 Peter chapter 2, the early witnesses some have cross and some have tree. There's perhaps the early ones have cross and the best ones have tree. Either way, it's hard to tell. All right, so we're going to look at Mark's use of the body. We've looked at the hanging of the king. We've looked at putting him on a tree or a cross. Now we're going to look at the use of the body taken down, the cave, and the rocks at the door. Marx uses these concepts, and starting in 1542, when evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if Jesus were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. So we've got the evening had come at the beginning, and then towards the end, we're laying him in a tomb hewn out of the rock. That's much like a cave. And then he rolled a stone in front of it. It's one big giant stone instead of a big heap of large stones. So many scholars point to Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 to explain why the Gospels tell of Jesus of Nazareth being taken down from the cross in the evening time. When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You must bury him that same day, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. And you see in there, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. That's basically what Paul is quoting in Galatians 3:13. He's quoting Deuteronomy here. And so the critical scholars will point out that Roman leaders would have let criminals crucified stay on the cross, regardless of the day of week. The simpler explanation here is that Mark was following the narrative of Jesus, son of Nun, in the book of Jesus, chapter 10, hanging the king of Jerusalem on a tree and taking him down at evening. That's what he did. And so that's what the update of the book does as well. Okay, it changes some things to update it, and it leaves some things the same so that you recognize them. All right, so here's a picture of tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This is about as good as tombs get. And these are basically very cave-like. So we're not talking about freestanding structures, generally speaking. A lot of pictures, a lot of drawings of Jesus's tomb or the wealthy tomb of Joseph of Arimathea as being some kind of freestanding tomb in the middle of a garden. But like, these are the tombs of kings, and it's pretty rough. Let's talk about the idea of mimesis a little bit. The basic theoretical principle in the creation of art, the word is Greek and means imitation, though it's in the sense of representation rather than of copying. Plato and Aristotle spoke of mimesis as the representation of nature. And that's from Britannica Online. And a popular example of mimesis, there's lots of examples of mimesis. It is a common Greco-Roman tool in writing, and it was a complement to the original to use it and reuse it in a new, beautiful way for an updated setting. If you did it right, it was a compliment. Otherwise, you got to be up to the task. Okay, so a popular one at the time of the Gospels, or near the time of the Gospels, was the Latin Virgil. He's Roman, and he's writing the Aeneid by reworking the Iliad and the Odyssey and incorporating various current legends, all combined together to create a masterpiece of Latin art there. And so he's working the old Greek Homeric epics that were written hundreds of years earlier, and he's updating them for the current regime residing in Rome. So mimesis sometimes is not mimesis is not the exact copy. When I'm talking about Luke or Matthew using mimesis, I'm definitely not talking about where they exactly copy Mark. That's not the same thing. That actually draws attention to their source, Mark's source, as well, and the fact that they're going to expand on Mark's source. So it incorporates the elements of the source in new ways. So in our example today, Jesus, son of Nun, killed the king of Jerusalem. Jesus of Nazareth was killed as king of the Jews. Okay, one sort of beginning and one sort of an end, because Mark is writing this at the as Jerusalem was burned to the ground along with the temple. So you can see why Jesus of Nazareth perhaps would not be a victorious figure there. So this can lead to criticism of proposed instances of mimesis, because it's hard to say, is this an expansion of the source, a contraction of the source? It takes a lot of hard work to completely justify that something is mimesis, and we'll talk about some of the better ones at doing that. So right now, going back to an aspect I think I left out here, the body remains or the body is gone. This is a great example of mimesis, where an aspect of the original story is updated for the sake of the new story. The old story makes a point that the body remains in the cave even today. And it wasn't so much the body as the pile of rocks outside of the cave. Piles of rocks remaining even to this day are common aspects of the Jesus son of Nun story. So, okay, Mark's story makes a point that the body is gone and Jesus has gone on to Galilee. That may be because he knows of Paul's letters already, and he's familiar with the concept of the dying and rising Jesus that predates the Jesus of Nazareth by Mark. So whether Mark is promoting a new religion or simply denigrating those who chose violent insurrection, the messenger of peace went unrecognized back to heaven. So let's talk about some practitioners here on the work of mimesis in the Gospels. Dr. Dennis MacDonald offers an entirely new view of the New Testament Gospel of Mark. The author of the earliest Gospel was not writing history, nor was he merely recording tradition, MacDonald argues. Close reading and careful analysis show that Mark borrowed extensively from the Odyssey and the Iliad, and that he wanted his readers to recognize the Homeric antecedents in Mark's story of Jesus. Mark was composing a prose anti-epic, MacDonald says, presenting Jesus as a suffering hero modeled after, but far superior, to traditional Greek heroes. So the only thing I would add to that is, first I would like to highlight that right there in the middle is he borrowed extensively from the Odyssey and the Iliad, and he wanted his readers to recognize that he borrowed from the Odyssey and the Iliad. And my sleuthing in the Old Testament, in my opinion, reveals that Mark also wanted his readers to recognize the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament antecedents of Mark's story of Jesus. So I'm just picking up on the clues of what Mark's laying down, is what I hope I'm doing here. So Thomas Brodie also did some work on mimesis, and his work has been widely read, and um, some aspects of his work have prevented it from gaining widespread acceptance, in my humble opinion. So what he does is he focuses primarily on the Elijah-Elisha narrative, where mine is three Jesus. And so he focuses on this Elijah narrative, and is an updated of the Elijah-Elisha narrative that Luke has written. And in doing this, he's going against all of critical scholarship in prioritizing Mark, or nearly all of critical scholarship in prioritizing Mark. And so that's kind of a stumbling block for people accepting his work. His work, to me, is very convincing, but it's even more convincing if he had applied it to Mark instead. And that's what I am trying to do. So, so that's two factors that are different. The fact is, you can look at the Gospels and say that they use a lot of Old Testament material, not just Elijah and Elisha. But mine is going to include Elishua as one of the three Jesuses, and the other two Jesuses, you could say, Moses did miracles with water. Well, so did Jesus. So did Elisha. As a matter of fact, he did more miracles with water than Moses did. And so we see doing miracles, and some people will apply that as a second Moses. And when you realize that the same miracle, we'll not just say it's a Jesus, because Jesus did miracles with water as well in the Old Testament, then you can kind of focus and realize that, and you don't have to think about all the hundreds of difference of people in the Old Testament that may allude in some way or another, or having commonalities with Jesus of Nazareth. So, in the Old Testament, when I asked that there are repeated themes in the Old Testament, an example would be Elijah reading many of the adventures of Moses, only slightly differently. Another of these themes was where a Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land. The first instance was Joshua, son of Nun. The second instance of a Joshua leading Israel into the Promised Land was Joshua, son of Jehozadak. So Elijah is modeled on Moses. Elisha and Joshua Jehozadak were modeled on Joshua Nun, or Jesus Nun. So they'll look closer at the names. So we all know the hymn, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. There's something about that name. Well, in Hebrew, it was Yehoshua, and that's usually translated to Joshua. Yeshua was a shortened or Aramaic version of the name, usually translated to Jeshua. And these names were translated to Jesus for the Greek version of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint. So the writers of the New Testament read the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and they were reading about these guys named Jesus. And so they wrote about Jesus of Nazareth. And English today would call that Jesus Jesus. So both Jesus and Joshua come from Yehoshua. When the authors of the New Testament Gospels they used the Greek Septuagint. I've already talked about that. They read the book of Jesus and read about Jesus of Jehozadak. Then they wrote about Jesus of Nazareth based partly on these two Old Testament characters. So how did this come about? It's not some kind of vast conspiracy to trick us. It's simply that when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, he used both the Latin and the Greek for the New Testament. And then he kind of changed things up by using the Masoretic, or a Hebrew text, alongside the Latin and Greek for the translation of the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, using this Masoretic, we got a Yehoshua, and through the German and then into the English, that comes down to us as Joshua. Ever since, most translations use two separate forms of the same name, Joshua and Jesus, for the New Testament. It's an artificial separation, but it is persistent, spreading throughout Bible translations in many languages. Jesus equaling Joshua is not equivocating. The names instead are artificially separated in the English language. One more note on translation is that there are no J's in the ancient Greek or Hebrew. Modern scholarship adopts a mishmash of translating of the ancient Greek and Hebrew. Sometimes scholars speak of the Israelite God Yahweh or the hero Yehoshua. At other times, the hard J is in the theophoric names such as Elijah, Abijah, Jehoshaphat, Jehoiakim. Because my writing is essentially about Jesus, I will prefer the hard J if I have a choice. And I will use Jesus for Yehoshua or Yeshua instead of Joshua or Jeshua. It's going to be Jesus. Jehovah, a rough equivalent of Yahweh, is the name I'll use in my writing and the name I will substitute for in the Lord when quoting the Bible. Jesus, back to Thomas Brodie. His big contribution was observing that the Gospels relied heavily on the Elijah-Elisha narrative. Brodie meticulously illustrates how the Gospel writers, and in particular Luke, used the Elijah to create a new character, Jesus of Nazareth. Brodie never mentions the symbolism in the name, however. Elisha is short for Elishua, meaning El saves, which is almost the same as Joshua, meaning Jehovah saves. There's an example in the Bible of a king named Eliakim having his name changed to Jehoiakim, and that is similar to the names of Elisha and Jesus, or Jehoshua. It's similar but not quite the same because Elijah also starts with the L. And this is significant because part of the argument for Elijah being a second Jesus is the symmetry of Elijah being based on Moses. In Exodus 3:14, one of the most famous sections in the Bible, Jehovah proclaims that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The name Elijah turns that around. Instead of Jehovah is God, it means God is Jehovah. So just as Moses passes along, another symmetry here. So let me cover this a little bit closer. So you've got Elishua, very similar to Joshua or Jesus. And the only difference is in the theophoric prefix. The theophoric is sort of like a God name. And so the prefix Yeho in Yehoshua, that's Jesus, is equal to the prefix El in Elishua. So Yahweh or Jehovah is equal to El. That's the point of Elijah. That is the point of Moses in Exodus 3:14. It's equating Jehovah with El, or promoting him to the supreme God, whichever way you want to look at that. So just as Moses passes along his spirit to Jesus Nun before dying, Elijah passed along his spirit in a double helping to Elisha. There are some other interesting symmetries showing that the EEN is an updated Moses-Jesus narrative. There are some key differences as well. For the sake of time, I will postpone further explanations until a later segment on another day. So, of the two second comings of Jesus, the first coming of Jesus being Jesus Nun, and we saw him in the book of Jesus. He killed the king of Jerusalem. But there's the two second Jesuses. We just finished talking about Elishua, and I mentioned earlier Jesus Jehozadak. So, just before the Elijah-Elisha narrative begins, for some reason, the author has to mention Jesus, son of Nun. And this is a great example of mimesis where the author says, trying to get the reader going to this source, and the source is Jesus, son of Nun, and now I'm going to tell you this story in this context of Jesus, son of Nun. So in Ahab's days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Jesus, son of Nun. And then there's Nehemiah 8:17. This could also be another author saying, hey, reader, pay attention. This story has a lot to do with Jesus Jehozadak, but I'm trying to get your attention. I'm going to mention Jesus, son of Nun, that Jesus Jehozadak is based on. So Nehemiah 8:17, and all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in them. And for from the days of Jesus, son of Nun, to that day, the Israelites had not done so, and there was very great rejoicing. So it's not common in the Old Testament to mention Jesus, son of Nun. As a matter of fact, these are the only two times after his death in the second chapter of Judges that Jesus, son of Nun, is mentioned in the Old Testament. So, and I would have to correct that if we talk about the Septuagint here, because of Sirach, I believe, mentions Jesus, son of Nun. However, as important it is to remember that the New Testament readers were reading about these Greek Septuagint Jesuses, that's separate from these two Jesuses, Elishua and Jesus Jehozadak, being based on Jesus Nun. That was done before the Septuagint, most likely, in the original Hebrew. So here we got Elijah copies Moses. Elisha was meant to copy Jesus. So Elijah's on Mount Oreb. He's talking directly with Jehovah, and Jehovah promises him something. He says, look, you're going to anoint Hazael. This is in the previous verse. And now in this verse, you're going to anoint Jehu. You're going to anoint Elishua. So he promises him he's going to anoint three people. And then he says, whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. So a couple of really important facts here. You see right there at the end, Elisha shall kill. Whoever escapes, Elisha shall kill. So this guy, you're going to see mass murder by Hazael and Jehu. And you would expect from this verse of this promise that you would also see mass murder from Elishua. He kills no one. He heals people and feeds people. And those miracles are the basis for Jesus of Nazareth of the Gospels. However, it looks like at one time there was an expectation that Elisha would kill. And if you look at the rest of the verse, there's other broken promises. In the previous verse, it says, "You shall anoint Hazael, king of Ram Damascus." And Elijah doesn't do that. Elishua goes up and tells Hazael that his master's not going to recover, and then Hazael murders his master and becomes king. Doesn't sound like there's any anointing at all in there, least of all by Elijah. And then Jehu is anointed by a servant of Elishua. So neither Elijah or Elishua directly anoint Jehu, but certainly Elijah doesn't anoint Jehu at all. So you really got to realize that if this is in the original, these promises, and it seems to me like these would be promises that were made, and when people rewrote what Elisha was instead of a mass murderer, they did not change this aspect or this promise that Elisha was going to mass murder. So we had an Elisha at one point that was meant to mimic the mass murder of Jesus, son of Nun. And we end up with an Elisha that we see today, who is a healer that is the prototype for Jesus, son of Nazareth. So quite a shift there. And I'm going to do a whole section on that. That's just a tease on there. So we have Jesus, son of Jehozadak, mimicking Jesus, son of Nun. And Jeremiah is predicting, he's at least predicting Jehozadak. Let's get into it. Therefore the days are surely coming, says Jehovah, when it shall no longer be said, as Jehovah lives, who brought the people out of Israel, out of the land of Egypt, but as Jehovah lives, who brought out and led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the land of the north and out of all the lands where he had driven them. So instead of the Exodus and the conquest, people are going to swear by Jehovah, who returned people from exile. Okay? And who is that person who's going to lead them out of exile? Just prior to that verse, these two verses, the days are surely coming, says Jehovah, when I will raise up for David, a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will live in safety. And this is the name by which he will be called. Jehovah is our righteousness. So Jehovah is our righteousness does not look like a name. And it says, and this is the name by which he will be called. Jehovah is our righteousness. Another way to say that is Jehozadak, and another version of this is Lord Brenton's English version of the English translation of the Septuagint. In his days, both Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell securely. And this is his name, which the Lord shall call him, Jehozadak, among the prophets. So Jeremiah is calling for Jehozadak to bring the people back. And what we have in Zechariah is Jesus, son of Jehozadak, bringing the people back. And Zechariah envisions two ceremonies involving Jesus, Jehozadak, and Zechariah cites the branch. However, it's not clear that he means Jesus, Jehozadak when he's citing the branch. However, he cites the branch in ceremonies involving Jesus, Jehozadak. So there are a lot of people who prefer to say that the branch is a direct descendant of David, Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel is all before Jesus, Jehozadak, except in one instance in the Old Testament. But I'm going to do a separate set of slides on this situation here in Zechariah. Is it Zerubbabel or is it Jesus, Jehozadak? And I think it's Jesus Jehozadak based on Jesus Nun. But at any rate, Jesus Jehozadak stands in for Israel as either he or Israel is being accused by Hasatan. And the accuser is rebuked and the sins are cleansed. Jesus Jehozadak takes off his rags and puts on clean clothing. And that's the opposite of what we saw happen to Jesus as he was mocked on a cross. And they put the purple robe on him to mock him. And then the robe off of him after mocking him and put on his own rags again. So this is an example of mimesis where just the opposite happened. And so it's going to take another day or two. Going to take another set of slides to argue many of these different things. Many of these things are going to take many different sets of slides. So there are countless examples of Mark directly using Jesus Nun and Elishua to build his Jesus. A close look at Jesus Jehozadak, and especially Ezra and Nehemiah's reactions to his descendants, will provide some of the major ideals of the New Testament Jesus movement. Mark also uses a son of David in building his Jesus, rewritten through the late edition of the author of Zechariah 9 through 14. Zechariah acts as a prism to a lot of situations, but that can't be covered today. This is already taking quite a while. After discovering that the adventures, miracles, and even the ideology of Jesus of Nazareth were built out of Jesus Nun, Jesus Jehozadak, Elishua, and the son of David, I switched positions in the historical Jesus debate, becoming a mythicist. So, I was a fan of Bart Ehrman's position, which of course predates by 100 years. It's at least 100 years old, the idea of an itinerant preacher walking from Galilee and going into Jerusalem, or some form of that itinerant preacher who's crucified and people thought he rose, and that being a current truth that inspired this Jesus narrative. And part of that is the intuition that, Jesus seems to come out of the year 30 of. You realize that there are various Jesus characters. There's a first coming of Jesus and two second comings of Jesus in the Septuagint. And these three characters provide a large portion of what Jesus of Nazareth is built out of. You begin to question the historicity. Certainly the 30 CE kind of discipline we're talking about Jesus is long before 30 of the current era. And these Jesuses did some of the same things. And that's the important thing. It's not just the name, it's the repetition of activities and ideologies. So I'm going to try to post on Sundays at 3 p.m. This post was way late because I did post one at 3 p.m. and there was no sound, and hopefully this has sound. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If you have watched all 44 minutes of this, then thank you.